Welcome to the FHU Leadership Podcast from the Center for Excellence in Spiritual Leadership at Freed-Hardeman University, the podcast dedicated to developing and encouraging spiritual leaders for the kingdom. And now here's your host, Dr. Josh Ketchum.
Welcome to Season 5, Episode 8, and I'm so excited to have Dr. Jeremy Weekley with me. And so, Jeremy, welcome to the FHU Leadership Podcast. Jeremy, how you doing?
I'm good, brother. Thanks for having me on the podcast. I've really enjoyed listening to it.
Well, thank you. So, Jeremy, tell us a little bit about yourself. When you went to Freed-Hardeman, where you're working at now, and just give us a little background on yourself.
Yeah. So, actually graduated from Freed-Hardeman with a business degree in human resource management way back in '99, right? In the aughts, 1999 there. And then actually went to work for the university for 7 years. I worked in different capacities, making music is coming up, and I used to produce that. So I used to do what Tony does now. And that's where I finished. And then I started preaching in Selmer, Tennessee, just, south of Henderson at the 4th Street congregation after my time at Freed-Hardeman. And I was there for about 9.5 years. And then we moved here to Knoxville, Tennessee, the promised land, right? Yeah, if you're a Vols fan. And I've been working at the West End congregation for a little over 9 years at this point. So, and I did go back and get a master's in ministry at Freed-Hardeman, probably one of the most challenging but rewarding degrees that I received. And here recently, it's funny to hear Dr. Jeremy Weekley. That's not something I've heard very much. Nobody really wants to call me that for good reason. But I finished up a doctorate in ministry at Liberty University recently in Christian leadership.
Well, thank you for saying that about Freed-Hardeman's programs, and also for putting the plug in for our graduate school. We would encourage anybody out there listening that's interested in a graduate degree to check that out, and we would love to talk to you about pursuing a graduate degree in education or in theology. So, Jeremy, you just recently did your DMin in a field related to church leadership, which is why you're on the podcast today, and to talk to you about some of the lessons you learned from that study related to your doctorate of ministry in church leadership. So tell us what specifically you were investigating and researching and some of the things that came out of that.
Yeah, so what I really was focused in on, of course, you have to eventually come up with what you call a problem statement or some kind of idea or project, something you're going to address in the church. And mine has always been, I guess for me, it's always been about leadership, and especially the aspect of shepherding and the idea of, throughout Scripture, you continue to see the shepherd motif, this picture of both leaders, God himself depicted as a shepherd. And so what I wanted to do was just kind of research and say, is there something out there that can help in the church leadership to figure out like what it looks like to be the shepherd that Jesus wants them to be. And so my problem eventually ended up being, how do you develop an effective biblical shepherding model? And really when I started that, so I'm a business guy, I kind of have a business background. I was looking for strategies and solutions. And one of my professors reminded me, is like, hey, listen, sometimes we don't always get the final answer. It's the journey, as to what you learn on the journey that is the most important. And really one of the big things that I learned was a lot of times I feel like church leaders are looking for solutions and strategies without first understanding what the model is supposed to be. Like the strategies get you there. But if you don't really know what the model is supposed to be, that's part of you're kind of starting on with a backwards approach to it. And so that's really where my research took me, was trying to understand what is the model of shepherd leadership in Scripture. And like I said, you have all these shepherds that God calls, and then what does that look like in the church today? And so that's really where the focus of my research was. And I found out, some lessons as far as I came up, with a list like everybody does, right? In church leadership, there's some kind of list that you give. So I've got some of those that I'll share with you a little bit. But, the reason, or I guess the model for a shepherding model is obviously Jesus. And that's, I don't think any of our listeners are going to, hear that and be like, oh, well, I thought it would be something else, right? But really, when you dive into that, there is, when Jesus calls himself the Good Shepherd in John 10:11, I think there's so much more to that, and that really could be, in essence, a key to say, this is what I want church leadership to look like in the future. Instead of, and again, those worldly models of leadership are not bad. There's really good strategies we get from, all these business leadership models. In fact, when you and Dr. Rogers were having a discussion about the books, leadership books, the last couple of podcasts, really good. And I love, all of those books that you guys talked about. But there are times when those strategies don't necessarily line up with the shepherding model of leadership in the church. And I think that's where perhaps we've brought too much of the worldly leadership in and maybe kind of started in the wrong place. Sometimes, not all the time.
I really like what you're saying, Jeremy. So what you're saying is we tend as church leaders to go to what's the solution? What do I need to do? It's kind of like if you're thinking about war in terms of a military approach. In the military, they're thinking about how do we go into the battle. But what you're saying is we need to think about what's our strategy in terms of how we're organized, how we're doing this, what's our philosophy in terms of how we're going to carry out the battle, how are we going to envision ourselves, and how are we going to do this? What's our methodology and our practice in doing it? And so, what in your assessment of that, what would you say are some of the, I guess speaking negatively here, some of the failures you see in our present day typical model compared to a shepherding model? Like what things jump out at you as say, these are red flags that show we're not really following the shepherding model?
Right. Yeah. Good question. And I think so. Number one, I'll say this, and it is, we do need to self-assess, obviously. But one of the things that I did in this was actually a case study of our eldership here at West End. Bless their hearts, they let me do that. They are very trusting men. But actually, what I found is there are a lot of elderships, a lot of elders individually that actually kind of naturally do this, but they don't really know that's what they're doing. And I think and this is, I just recently presented this to our eldership. I think if they were more aware of the things they are doing that are in line with that, they would truly enjoy being an elder more than what they do now. Because again, back to the kind of the worldly model, especially, post-industrial revolution, we have become very like, get around the table, make decisions. And that was, there are times where that is still very much needed. Budget planning, if you're going to do a building project, you got to have long meetings. Unfortunately, very managerial in focus. But the real work of a shepherd isn't done in a conference room, right? It's done in living rooms. As far as the church is concerned, it's done with individuals. And three things that I found in a successful shepherding models, ones that I investigated and said, okay, this looks like more like what the biblical model is. One is they are modeled after Jesus. So in essence, you go back, we often start in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1. And that's a great place. We should, as we're looking for men, that's where we should be. But even before that, we should go back and look at, these are people who are supposed to model themselves after Jesus. And even those lists of qualifications in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1 really give us some of those clues. And then as Peter talks to the elders of Ephesus and Miletus. So one is it's got to be modeled after Jesus. Two is it's got to be biblically based. So let's go back to Scripture to see what God has placed before us as far as good leadership models. Again, not wrong to use worldly models, but let's focus on what God has designed for us. And the last one is it has to be relational. I know one of the things you guys talked about when you talked with Dr. Rogers about a book was, they smell like sheep. And most definitely, if you're going to be a shepherd, if you're going to have a good shepherding model, you will have to smell like the sheep. You can't be in a back room in a conference room and just think that you're going to lead the congregation and people grow spiritually, be edified, be taken care of, encouraged, all those things. If you're kind of doing that in a vacuum, you got to smell like them. You got to be where they are. And so those are three things that make up a successful shepherding model. And then what I found in addition to that were 5 key elements of shepherding that as I look at the life of Jesus, his mission, his message, his method, there were 5 things that I found that I believe were key elements that will help shepherds to figure out what does that really look like.
All right. Before we get to those 5 key elements, because I am excited to hear those, do you think that you mentioned post-war um, America, kind of the business world. Do
Mhm.
you think that the business world and the business model of managerial emphasis kind of works against the shepherding model, and that especially in the American culture, this makes the shepherding model a challenge because it's not actually just kind of the intuitive way we think or the way we select or expect leaders to be?
Yeah, I think it can. Again, I think there's still certain aspects of, kind of quote unquote how we do business,
Mhm.
that the fact of we've moved very much from an agrarian society, which is where the shepherding model in Scripture is seen as, you know they they didn't have big buildings and those kind of things. So I think there are things. In fact, in one of the elders meeting, well, actually one of the elders, when I presented this to him, he said, sometimes we've kind of put a hedge around ourselves with all the business that we have to do because we have buildings, because we have, water bills, and we have all this that we have to, all these things we have to take care of. And again, none of those are bad. Those are really blessings. Those are tools that we're supposed to use, but they do require some management that really does take the focus away from the sheep. It's more about taking care of the sheep pen, and the books, so to speak, than it is caring for the sheep themselves. And again, being an elder, that's a part of it. You are the leaders, you are financially responsible for the church, but more so, you are spiritually responsible. And I think that's really where the shepherding model is to me should be the priority as far as your model. And then one of those key elements I'll talk about does involve the managerial aspect of it, which is something that they have to do. But I do think that business model it's created some distance maybe, between the elders and the shepherds and the sheep. I think there has been a little bit of
Well,
distance. Yeah.
it may be that it often is just assumed that that is all that's needed. And what you're really saying is, yes, that's needed,
Mhm.
but that's not all of it. There certainly needs to be a lot more too. That's a part of, if you're a shepherd over 100 sheep, yes, you got to keep track of them and you got to take care of their expenses and make sure they have food and all that kind of stuff. But you also got to know those sheep. And so it takes both.
Yeah.
It's a both and, not a either or. And so what are those five essential things that you determined?
Yeah, so before I get into those, let me address something you just said, because in the one of the things I did for a project was to actually interview you, and there was something you brought to my attention that I later found and really kind of did a deep dive on with, from a book from a guy named Timothy Whitmer, and
Mhm.
he talks about the difference in micro shepherding and macro shepherding. And I think that
Mhm.
would be a great conversation for elders to have, is what's the difference? Micro shepherding is obviously things you do that are more personal with the sheep, with individuals, smaller groups, where you get to know them. You figure out what kind of feed they need, right? Maybe they need some encouragement, maybe they need to be equipped somehow. And then macro shepherding is kind of more the collective. And that's where sometimes you have to make decisions together as a group. They should make decisions together as a group. But we often think of shepherding or being an elder, or a lot of men do the eldership as the macro only. And the micro is really where the shepherding gets done. And if you don't have good micro shepherding techniques and methods and uh, and desires, well, then your macro shepherding is not going to be beneficial. It's going to get bogged down all the time in the financial stuff. So one of the things because that kind of led me to some of these key elements. These are things that involve both micro and macro shepherding, for the eldership. Um, so the five key elements I came up with are that the shepherding model, a successful shepherding model, involves the element of edifying. The elders are to edify, and that can mean both encourage. It could also mean that there are times where folks need to be admonished in order to grow spiritually. And so all of that is included. That's a key element. Jesus did both of those things, right? Another one is equipping. In Ephesians 4, it's just kind of laid out that a part of our role as church leadership, whether it's a minister or even more importantly, an elder, is to equip the flock. And I think there are times where if we don't have this aspect, this is where I see bottlenecks occur in church leadership. If everything has to flow through the eldership and we're not taking advantage of equipping the deacons and ministry leaders in your congregations, everything moves slowly. Everything gets just stuck. And then deacons get frustrated, ministry leaders get frustrated. There's little communication about those things. They just kind of come to a grinding halt. And so equipping is important because those are supposed to be important aspects of the church, those deacons, those people, being able to use their skills and talents. Another area is obviously from the Great Commission. Shepherds are to be involved in evangelizing. And I think that sometimes we have the idea that that's just going out and having Bible studies. I think a greater part of that is the vision, the culture that you set forth in the congregation, that we want to share this message, and then also continuing to help the congregation to grow by continuing to help them understand better what's all wrapped up in that good news. And so that leads to the next one, that is educating. If they are pastor teachers, they are supposed to be able to teach, then I think that's a vital role for them. Jesus taught over and over again. And that last one is where you have more of these managerial, sometimes the discipline even that has to come in as a leader, which is one of the most challenging things to do. And that's exercising oversight. So you can see they all start with E, right? Yeah, I'm a preacher. So they all start with E, and just about every list you find of this kind of study, you're going to find something that either spells something or everything has the first letter the same. So what can I say?
But you used all very biblical words and all
Mm-hmm.
ones that really describe what the role of the shepherd is. I
Mm-hmm.
really like that. And you also got a very comprehensive description of what that role is by these terms. And so I really liked the 5 essential things. So, kind of diving into that, which one out of those 5 would would you say, let's start with the strength, which one would you say most elderships in your observation are the strongest at? And maybe even elders, maybe we should talk about elders as an individual, because there's an individual
Mm-hmm.
component here. uh and then we'll talk about which one do you think is the weakest.
Yeah, so good. And I would say probably the exercising oversight is probably the one that most, again, going back to kind of this worldly model of doing business, that exercising oversight from the standpoint of making sure the budget is set every year, right? Having some of the books balance out, that kind of stuff. Those are the things that I think a lot of elderships really take seriously, as they should. But that's kind of what they've kind of been taught to do in their whatever their business practice is, right? Um, so I think that's probably one that a lot of them would say, yeah, we do a good job. We keep false doctrine out, right? We don't allow false doctrine to come into the church, and that's all a part of that exercising oversight. As far as the standpoint of maybe an area where I've seen some weaknesses, I think number one is equipping. I've already kind of talked about that some. If we're not delegating, we have bottlenecks occur in not only programs, but also sometimes those programs involve people's lives. If we're trying to, like that Acts 6, if we're trying to share, some important ministry and put it in the hands of a person, but we don't actually put it in their hands and allow them to make decisions and encourage them, and then come back and ask them, what do you need from us to make this ministry successful? How can we help you? What kind of vision or insight do you need from us? Then they're just a deacon in name only, right? They just kind of, well, this is what I'm in charge of. And when something goes wrong, somebody calls me, instead of, sharing, saying, we want you to take this ministry and run with it. And so I think those, whether it's macro from the standpoint of all the elders together, or micro, the individual elders, those are two. Now, one of the things when I did the case study here that I like, and I said this at the beginning, that I saw more of than I had realized was going on, was at the micro level, like the individual elder level, men, and how much they do seek to care for the flock, to edify people. I just kind of stepped back, and what I did was for 2 weeks, I tried not to really, walk around and shake hands in the auditorium. I just kind of stood back and at different events and watched our elders. And it was really neat, Josh, because I saw things I've never seen before. One of our elders, in between Bible class and worship, there was a lady that came up to me, and I have to do the welcome, so I'm trying to, get down front. She's crying. She needs to talk to somebody. And I'm like, hey, let's pray. One of our elders came up and he said, you go on. And he stood there with her, talked to her. And as I was doing the welcome, I could look through the glass doors into the lobby. He was praying with her. And man, that to me, that's shepherding, right? You see a sheep that's hurt. You don't say, well, I'll talk to you after service. I mean, he took that time in that moment. You can do that with macro shepherding too. One of our elders recently, I love this. I got to brag on these guys. The chairman said, hey, they usually meet like twice a month, every other week. And he said, for the next meeting, we're not going to be in this room. We're all going to choose we're going to go to some, young person's ball game. We're going to go see somebody at the nursing home. We're going to do this, that we're going to go out and smell like the sheep. And I was like, man, that's awesome. I love that.
Mhm.
And I think sometimes, especially as a preacher, I think sometimes I can be a little hard on the elders and say, well, they're not shepherding. Yeah, they are. I think sometimes it's just that shepherding work is not as visible as the teaching aspect, as the exercising oversight to get up and say, we're going to start a building program, or we've hired a preacher, or we've made this decision. This is the kind of work, though, that congregations need, because we have so many people with so many needs, and those need to be addressed.
Amen to that. And that's there's a level of trust that the members have of the elders that often they don't have with located preachers that are
Mhm.
brought in, because they've watched these guys, and these guys have lived it out for years, and they've selected these men to lead them. And so there's a level of trust, and they're hungering and they're desiring that. And they also really crave that encouragement and that appreciation and that leading from them. And so when elders step into that vacuum, church members are very willing to follow and lead. And so I think it really helps the eldership be able to lead in the exercising oversight if they smell like sheep, as you said, in the other areas, because then these people love them and trust them. And so when they have to make a decision that maybe they don't agree with, they'll still follow them because they know they love them.
As long as it's not firing me, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Yeah. I can
Yeah,
tell you have
most
a good relationship though with.
Oh, I do. I love these men, and I love the men at 4th Street too. They were, they went through some really hard times there, and what kept that congregation together was that eldership. And again, I think sometimes we all the things that go wrong, we automatically go to the elders. But there are a lot of things that most likely everybody listening to this, your elders are doing right, and they're doing naturally right because they want to be pleasing to God. But that's why I thought if I could set this in front of them to say, think about these specific aspects. And one of the things that came out practically is, and I know a lot of eldership struggle with this, is like, meetings that just seem to go on and on and on and on. And so one of the things I asked our elders to consider is, okay, in the future, when you do have these conference room meetings, look at these 5 elements, and whoever's chairman, whatever issues have come, where do you place that in here? Where do you place that in these 5 key elements? And if it doesn't fit really well, and you're going to have a purposeful conversation about it, it might be the work of a deacon. It might be that you just need
Yeah.
to hand it off to a minister and say, hey, could you investigate this and just report back to us in an email? Instead of spending 20 minutes when you could have addressed something quickly, assigned it, and then moved on, and then had better information the next time. And so that's one of those things that I was trying to find, because I'm a very practical person in my preaching and
Mhm.
in my study. And I was like, what does this mean? Like where is a real world, situation where this could actually be valuable for all elderships? And that was one of the areas I thought of. We haven't really tried that yet as far as the elders here. So we'll see how that goes. But I think it could help groups. It might.
Yeah. It kind of creates a filter to run these through and say, all right, and then it can encourage you in the reverse, in that if you look at this and say, all right, yes, what we're talking about in this meeting does meet this criteria, we need to talk about it. But if it doesn't, then let's delegate that out. Because so many things, I think, going back to that Acts 6 model, if the apostles did not delegate, they would have not been able to continue in the work of preaching and prayer. And also, they delegated that to the 7 servants, and they didn't tell them how to feed the widows. They said, your job is to go feed the widows. They gave them the authority, the responsibility to carry that mission out. And I think that's where elders, would really benefit themselves when they do delegate out that responsibility. And they still can come back and oversee that, but they make sure that it's done and give a vision. And then they're able to move on to other things and have the time to stay connected with the sheep.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, that, like you said, that gives them time to get to know the sheep. Jesus says, hey, I know my sheep and my sheep know my voice. And so they can spend time, they know Jesus, and then they get to go out and model him by getting to know the members here. And so on that micro level, when you do that, when you are out there encouraging, edifying, equipping, and then you come back into the room with everybody else and you start to make a decision, like you said, as a group that's going to affect the entire congregation. And that's another thing I noticed about our men. Anytime they say, okay, this is the decision we're going to make, they will all kind of know of people that might struggle with that decision. And they're like, okay, well, how are we going to address that with, in their mind, like with this person? And to me, that's that shepherding aspect that's come in. They know the sheep, they know some of these sheep really well, and that they might struggle with this. And so they know how they need to go and talk to them specifically and, smooth that over or just listen to their concerns. And so that's the idea of knowing those sheep and shepherding is that if you smell like them, you're going to know, when things are going great, you're going to know it. When things are about to go bad, you will have seen it. You kind of see things coming because you know how they respond to things. So
Yeah.
it's important.
Yeah. So Jeremy, thinking about this a little bit more, did you do any thoughts? I may throw you off with this question. If I do, just do any thoughts on like how many shepherds it takes per person? In other words, like if you have a church of 300, how many elders do you think you really need per 50 people, however that is, to be able to meet the needs of the shepherding needs of that congregation? Did you come across anything like that? What's your thoughts on that? And
Yeah, I didn't really come across anything necessarily like that, but I know that when they've had discussions here and other places where I've been, as a congregation grows, number one, you have to have people that are qualified. So as you start looking at that, that has to be part of the discussion. But like here, they've decided to break the congregation into what we call focus groups. And that is each elder has a certain number of people that allows them to be a little bit more involved in that micro shepherding aspect and get to know them individually. But man, really, once you get past about, 50 like adults, right? If you have like 50 adults that you're overseeing, that's going to be really hard. Um, and so if you're going to do that, if it's going to be like 50, adults per shepherd, well, you're going to have to really make a concerted effort to create those micro moments, right, with your sheep, as opposed to just on a Sunday, right, and happen to be there with them and, just kind of checking them off the list. Hey, they're here, they're not here, I need to call them. That gets really tough to spend individual time, quality time with people. Now, again, every congregation has people that are, part of that core and then kind of just outside of that and then the fringe. And so we understand there's going to be kind of different levels of involvement as well. But like our shepherds here want to bring as many people from the fringe closer as they can. And that's part of the reason for the focus groups. One of our elders with his focus group, he invites them if we have like a fifth Sunday or something like a church, and then you eat and have, worship again, and we have the evening free. He tries to invite all of his focus group people over. So, you know, if this guy's wife, if you have like 75 people and this guy's wife is like, you want me to feed 75 people? So, I mean, it's a lot of people, right? But that's kind of, that's once you get past like 50, to me, that's starting to stretch it some. If you're talking about 50, pretty good active adults, because it's going to be really hard. If you only have 52 weeks a year, that's pretty tough.
Yeah. So really what you're saying is, as a part of the shepherding model, elderships need to kind of think along the lines of, I can't know everybody in this congregation. If this congregation is, let's say, above 150 to 200, I can't know everybody, but we as an eldership need to know everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And so you almost need to divide out, as you're suggesting they did there at West End. And so that one elder may really be focused on this segment of the congregation And he then really makes sure to shepherd that group while other elders make an effort to shepherd other groups. And you try to keep those in manageable sizes so that there can be attention given. And so hopefully people don't fall through the cracks, right? Instead of feeling
Yeah.
maybe the old model is, because I understand the whole eldership is responsible for the whole church, but not
Right.
everybody can micro connect on a one-on-one level with everybody in the church.
Right. Yeah. And one of the things I suggested too with those 5 key elements is maybe what you do is, and a lot of managers will do this. This is, management's trying to become more personal. You take those 5 key elements. And so what you do is you say, okay, this week as an elder, in my focus group, who's somebody that needs edification? Who's somebody that needs to be equipped? What can I do? Maybe can I take somebody to lunch and challenge them in some way? What kind of evangelism needs to happen within my focus group, education, and then a ministry. Our elders kind of divide the ministries as well. Which deacon that I'm working with in my areas of emphasis, how do I need to reach out to them and encourage them and challenge them this week? And if you can do that kind of, every 2 weeks or whatever, you come into a meeting and you've got, prayer requests of people that maybe nobody else knows anything about. They've been keeping it quiet, but you found out because you reached out to them. You thought they might need edification, and they do. So even within those 5 elements, I think there are things that will help from the micro level, but also from the macro level, right? To bring those things to the group as a whole so that everybody at the table is aware of Sister Susie's problem, not so they can tell everybody, but so they can pray about it and they can encourage her as well. It's just nobody knew about it. So.
And then Sister Susie feels like she's got an elder that she knows is connected with her, and she's not just lost in the overall. And then she can make sure. Yeah, I think those are great suggestions. And I love the idea of thinking about that with deacons too, of trying to really delegate to the deacons, but also having some deacons that elders are intentionally wanting to mentor and stay plugged in with along with their ministries. All right, Jeremy, we're about out of time, but I want to ask you, is there anything else? Because I know you you wrote a dissertation on this, so you could share for hours. But is there anything else that you would just really want to share that you haven't shared on this topic?
Yeah, so I think one last thing is one of the things I hit in my paper was that sometimes there's a reluctance to talk about shepherding because they feel like it's a soft idea. But man, you go back and look in scripture at shepherds. I mean, David as a shepherd has to kill a lion and a bear. There is nothing soft about that. And shepherding is not a soft thing. It's not meant to be like, oh, we're just going to hold a lamb and pet it. It's the idea that we're leading.
I like the voice change too. We're just going to hold a lamb.
So Billy, in our podcast, Billy gets on to me. I do a lot of voice changes. Anyway, but we're not just like petting lambs or something. Like we're trying to lead. You can't drive sheep; they'll scatter. You're trying to lead them, like in the 23rd Psalm, to these places where they're gonna be fulfilled and grow and be taken care of, protected, all of those things on their journey someday through the valley of the shadow of death to come out on the other side living in the light of the Lord for all eternity. And our guys here, they take that serious. The elders I worked with at 4th Street took that serious. All elders that I'm aware of take that serious. It's just, how can we help them figure out to do that more effectively and more from a biblical standpoint? And I think when they do this, all the guys here, when I did the case study, that's the part of being an elder that they love and enjoy. Let's let them do more of that. And then you're going to see the congregation grow as well, not just numerically, but spiritually. You're going to have a deep congregation, a deep understanding of what it means to be a disciple, what it means to be, both a shepherd, but also a sheep that is trusting of these men to lead you home. So that's the last thing I would say.
That's good stuff there. I really appreciate what you said. And congratulations too on being Dr. Jeremy Weekley. I know you, you didn't do it about the title. You did it to serve and learn, but it is something that's worthy of congratulations, and we appreciate you joining us. And you mentioned your podcast. Why don't you give that a plug before we close it out?
Yeah. So Billy Beard and I, he's the preacher at Foot Street in Corinth. And we do a podcast called Not Just Sundays. And right now, the season we're in right now, we're talking about, the customs, culture, and the Christian. So there are things that we often are, kind of traditional. And so how do we approach those from a biblical standpoint? We've talked about, Sunday nights and We've talked about just customs and culture in general within the church. So just, and you are, if you don't like humor, don't listen to it, because I do like to have fun, even when I'm talking about the Bible. So, I'll laugh and I'll change my voice, and I've got I've got a little character that I bring on every once in a while. So, anyway, I have fun with it.
Well, neat. Well, I
Yeah.
appreciate you sharing that. And
Yes.
thank you. And we wish you the best in continuing to share this important stuff about how elders can be more effective in shepherding.
All right.
Thank you. And we look forward to future episodes of the FHU Leadership Podcast.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the FHU Leadership Podcast. To listen to previous episodes and see the services the Center for Excellence in Spiritual Leadership offers, please visit www.supportingspiritualleadership.com. Again, that's www.supportingspiritualleadership.com. Until next time, remember, God uses ordinary people to lead his people to extraordinary feats.